Part 1. The Bronx Confrontation and the Architecture of Contradiction. The atmosphere within the community center in the heart of the Bronx was saturated with a tension so profound it felt as though the very oxygen had been replaced by a heavy, invisible weight, a metaphorical blade poised in the air, awaiting the inevitable moment of descent. This was not the sterile, controlled environment of a high-gloss Washington, D.C. television studio, where political discourse is often sanitized for the masses. Rather, this was the visceral reality of the Bronx, the very district that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez claimed as her foundation and her sanctuary. Under the harsh, flickering luminescence of industrial fluorescent lights that hummed with a persistent, agitated vibration reminiscent of a swarm of angry hornets, the people she vowed to champion sat in rows of humble folding chairs. These were the working families of New York, individuals who had sacrificed hours from jobs they could not afford to leave, single mothers who had navigated the complexities of childcare they could barely finance, and elderly residents whose weary bodies protested every step they took to reach this hall. They were joined by a younger generation, those who had once viewed her digital proclamations as a beacon of hope for a more equitable future. They had gathered not for a performance, but for an accounting. They had seen the viral photographs. They felt the crushing weight of accumulating bills while their representative ascended the heights of global fame, and they were profoundly exhausted by a cycle of grand promises that seemed to yield little more than social media engagement. They were tired of the struggle, tired of the rhetoric, and increasingly disillusioned by the sight of their congresswoman inhabiting a world of elite luxury while simultaneously delivering lectures on the nature of systemic privilege. The stage itself was an exercise in stark simplicity, featuring 2 chairs and 2 microphones, representing the impending collision of 2 diametrically opposed visions of the American experience. Senator Ted Cruz stood with a calculated, formidable composure, projecting the intellectual gravity of a Harvard law graduate combined with the strategic patience of a career prosecutor. He was a man whose career had been defined by arguing complex cases before the Supreme Court and engaging in high-stakes intellectual combat, with figures ranging from Bernie Sanders to cultural icons, often leaving his adversaries rhetorically diminished. On this particular evening, however, the event was not framed as a traditional debate. It was structured as a public inquiry, and Cruz had assumed the mantle of the prosecutor. Across from him sat Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, adorned in a sharp, designer-styled blazer, exuding the polished aesthetic of a modern media sensation. She was the undisputed sovereign of TikTok and an Instagram revolutionary, a figure who had revolutionized political branding through the lens of a smartphone. Yet, beneath the unforgiving glare of the Bronx Community Center lights, the radiant confidence that usually characterized her digital output appeared to be under significant duress. In the presence of her own constituents and under the analytical, unblinking stare of a legal mind like Cruz's, the ability to edit the narrative or curate the perspective had vanished. She attempted to project her hallmark smile, the charismatic expression that had garnered millions of likes, but it failed to resonate, betraying a sense of profound vulnerability in this unscripted arena. Senator Cruz initiated the proceedings not with a cordiality, but with a foundational challenge, suggesting that the Congresswoman might be operating under a fundamental misunderstanding regarding the intersection of political theater and the lived reality of her constituents. He clarified that his objective was not to dwell on misunderstandings or nuances, but to examine the objective facts of her tenure and the choices she had made. He proposed a deep dive into her authentic identity, stripped of the digital filters and the carefully managed persona of a TikTok revolutionary. He sought to address the version of Ocasio-Cortez that the people of the Bronx were beginning to perceive with an increasingly clear and sober eye. He allowed a deliberate pause to linger, permitting the silence to settle over the assembly, a specific, heavy silence that indicates a collective awareness that a difficult revelation is imminent. He observed that she had campaigned on a platform of democratic socialism, positioning herself as the ultimate champion of the working class and a fierce critic of capitalist structures. She had built an international brand as the voice of the impoverished and the defender of the forgotten American worker. However, he argued, her personal lifestyle did not mirror the austerity or the communal sacrifice she demanded of others. Instead, she appeared to be flourishing within the very capitalist heights she condemned. He contended that she did not embody the struggle she championed, but rather enjoyed a level of luxury and status that stood in stark opposition to her rhetoric. In his opening assessment, Cruz declared that she was not the voice of the laboring class, but rather a figure who utilized their hardships as a platform for her own social and political elevation, promising that the evidence presented would substantiate this claim. Round 1. The Met Gala and the Aesthetics of Elite Participation. The first piece of evidence flickered onto the expansive screen behind the participants, a high-resolution photograph of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez ascending the grand steps of the Metropolitan Museum of Art during the Met Gala. In the image, she appeared with the bearing of royalty, her custom-designed gown flowing behind her, featuring the slogan, "Tax the Rich," emblazoned in aggressive, scarlet lettering across the back. She was ensconced in a sea of A-list celebrities and elite power players, posing with a visible sense of belonging within one of the most exclusive social circles on the planet. The image was undeniably striking, and the aesthetic was powerful. But above all, it radiated a sense of immense wealth and access. Cruz permitted the photograph to remain on the screen for a protracted, uncomfortable period, allowing the irony to be absorbed by the residents of the Bronx who were watching from their modest seats. For many in the room, seeing this display of opulence in their own neighborhood while sitting in direct proximity to her evoked a visceral reaction that was far removed from the excitement of a social media feed. He pointed out the inherent contradiction. She had chosen to attend a function where ticket prices exceeded the annual income of many families in her district, a place where excess was not merely tolerated, but celebrated with theatrical flair. When Ocasio-Cortez attempted to frame her attendance as a deliberate act of political disruption, an effort to bring a message of economic justice into the very heart of elite society, Cruz was prepared with a devastating counter-analysis. He produced an additional, candid photograph from within the event, one that had not been part of her official media narrative. This image depicted the Congresswoman laughing with genuine joy, a glass of high-end champagne in her hand, appearing entirely at home among the billionaires she publicly decried. He asked the audience to consider whether this looked like the behavior of an outsider attempting to dismantle a system, or rather, someone who was deeply enamored with the status and luxury that the system provided. He then redirected the focus toward the daily lives of those in the room, asking them to recall their own experiences on that same evening. While their representative was being celebrated in Manhattan's highest social circles, many of them were likely finishing exhaustive double shifts, dealing with the frustrations of an unreliable transit system, or sitting at a kitchen table with a calculator, attempting to determine which essential expenses could be deferred for another month. He spoke of parents who skipped meals to ensure their children were fed, and the elderly who were forced to choose between necessary medical treatments and basic utilities. The room descended into a heavy, contemplative silence as the magnitude of this disconnect became undeniable. An individual in the back of the hall stood up, his voice trembling with a mixture of sorrow and indignation. He recounted how his grandmother was currently being forced to ration her essential medications due to rising costs, while her supposed representative was attending a gala that cost a fortune. He spoke of the quiet dignity of his children, who shared a single pair of shoes without complaint, and compared their reality to the theatrical revolutionary performance he saw on the screen. His words acted as a catalyst for a broader sense of betrayal within the room, highlighting the chasm between the digital activism Ocasio-Cortez practiced and the tangible suffering of the people she was elected to serve. Cruz emphasized that her participation in the gala was not an act of subversion, but a visible sign of her assimilation into the very elite class she claimed to oppose, suggesting that she was using the struggles of the poor as a decorative element for her own social advancement. Round 2. The financial disconnect and the reality of compensation. The proceedings then transitioned into a rigorous examination of the financial realities of Ocasio-Cortez's life since her arrival on the national stage. Cruz presented her official financial disclosure documents, records that are public by law, but which few citizens have the time to investigate in depth. He highlighted the fact that her congressional salary alone placed her in a bracket of earners that was significantly higher than the median income of the Bronx. He noted with clinical precision that she earned more in a single calendar year than many of the families in her district would earn in half a decade of labor. He allowed that mathematical reality to linger in the room. 5 years of a constituent's sweat, exhaustion, and daily sacrifice were equivalent to just 12 months of her government-funded compensation. He questioned the moral consistency of a socialist who decries wealth inequality while maintaining a lifestyle and an income that are fundamentally removed from the experience of the working class. The inquiry further scrutinized the management of her campaign finances, specifically pointing to the substantial payments made to her partner, Riley Roberts, for consulting services. Cruz questioned the ethics of soliciting small-dollar donations from people who were often making a significant financial sacrifice to support her cause, only to have that money directed toward her own personal inner circle. An elderly teacher in the front row expressed a profound sense of disappointment, explaining that her own contribution of $50 had been a meaningful gesture from her modest paycheck, given with the hope that it would support a movement for real change. The revelation that her hard-earned money might have contributed to the personal financial stability of the Congresswoman's partner felt like a breach of the sacred trust between a representative and the represented. Ocasio-Cortez attempted to defend these as standard campaign expenditures, but the teacher countered that it was ultimately a question of integrity and the message it sent to those who were truly struggling. The focus then shifted to the specifics of her living arrangements in Washington, D.C., where she resided in a luxury apartment complex that featured amenities far beyond the reach of the average American. Cruz noted that the monthly rent for such a residence was a figure that many families in her district would find insurmountable for their entire household budget. He contrasted this comfort with the struggles of her own family members, suggesting that she had prioritized her own elevated standard of living under the guise of being an important national figure. Furthermore, he addressed her choice of personal transportation, a high-end electric vehicle that she had frequently showcased on social media as a symbol of her commitment to environmental progress. Cruz reframed this as an example of being profoundly out of touch, noting that while she drove a vehicle costing $60,000, the people of her district were forced to rely on a transit system that was increasingly unreliable and aging. A young man in the audience shared his own story of graduating from college only to find himself working in retail and living with his parents because the cost of an independent life was too high. He spoke of the irony of being lectured on privilege by someone whose daily mobility was defined by a luxury vehicle that he could not even begin to afford. Cruz concluded the segment by arguing that Ocasio-Cortez was not an observer of inequality, but an active participant in it, one who preached a gospel of sacrifice while insulating herself from the very hardships she described. Round 3. The Amazon HQ. Controversy and the cost of ideology. One of the most economically significant chapters of Ocasio-Cortez's career was the subject of the next round: her pivotal role in the cancellation of Amazon's planned headquarters in New York. Cruz displayed a prominent headline announcing the loss of 25,000 potential high-paying jobs, followed by a screenshot of her own tweet celebrating the event as a victory for the community over corporate interests. He mockingly referred to her as the Congresswoman from Instagram, suggesting that her political decisions were driven more by the desire for a viral moment than by a genuine concern for the long-term economic health of her district. He addressed the parents in the room directly, asking them if they had viewed the Amazon project as a rare opportunity for their children to secure stable, well-paying careers in fields like technology, logistics, and management paths to the middle class that were becoming increasingly rare. He pointed out that the 25,000 jobs did not simply cease to exist. They were relocated to Virginia, where families were now experiencing the growth and stability that she had rejected for New York. He highlighted the fact that while she had garnered international praise from progressive activists for standing up to power, the tangible result for her constituents was a vacuum of opportunity. A veteran construction worker, whose hands bore the marks of a lifetime of manual labor, spoke about the dream he had of working on that massive infrastructure project alongside his son, a dream of building something substantial for their city and securing their family's future. He expressed a deep sense of resentment that this opportunity had been traded for a political victory that offered no benefit to the people on the ground. He accused her of prioritizing her national political brand and her ideological purity over the immediate need for jobs and investment in the community. Cruz argued that her opposition to the project was not rooted in a desire to protect the community from gentrification, as she claimed, but rather in a need to maintain a narrative of victimhood that fueled her political movement. He suggested that her career thrived on the existence of struggle, and that actual economic progress might diminish the urgency of her rhetoric. A mother in the audience shared a heart-wrenching story of her son, a college graduate who was still working a low-wage retail job and living at home, who had wept when the news of the Amazon cancellation broke because it represented his best chance at an independent career. She asked the Congresswoman how she could justify celebrating the destruction of thousands of potential futures for the sake of an Instagram post. The critique was a powerful reminder that political ideology often has a human cost, and that for the people of the Bronx, the victory Ocasio-Cortez celebrated felt very much like a defeat. Round 4. Personal integrity and the ethics of representation. The fourth segment of the inquiry moved into deeply personal territory, focusing on the condition of Ocasio-Cortez's grandmother's home in Puerto Rico, following the devastation of Hurricane Maria. Cruz displayed photographs that the Congresswoman herself had shared on social media, showing the lingering damage to the property, leaking roofs, visible mold, and a general state of disrepair years after the storm had passed. He noted that she had used these images to deliver a scathing critique of government failure and systemic neglect, which had prompted an outpouring of sympathy and financial support from the public. However, Cruz then presented evidence suggesting that despite her significant income and the vast sums of money raised through her political organizations, the repairs to the home remained unaddressed for an extended period. He accused her of utilizing her own family's suffering as a theatrical backdrop for fundraising and political messaging. The room was visibly shaken by the revelation that Ocasio-Cortez had reportedly declined offers from private contractors and charitable organizations to repair the home at no cost, labeling such gestures as political stunts. Cruz argued that it was more strategically useful for her narrative to have her grandmother continue to live in a damaged residence than to allow anyone outside her ideological circle to be seen as providing a solution. An elderly woman in the crowd, who had contributed what she could to the Hurricane Relief Fund, expressed her profound heartbreak at the idea that her sacrifice might have been used to fund a political machine, rather than providing direct aid to a family in need. The implication was that the Congresswoman had prioritized the optics of the struggle over the actual resolution of the problem, even when it involved her own kin. Cruz questioned the fundamental character of a representative who would allow a family member to endure such conditions for the sake of a viral moment. He suggested that if she was willing to exploit the suffering of her own grandmother for political gain, there was little reason to believe she would prioritize the well-being of her constituents over her own career ambitions. This part of the inquiry struck a deep chord with the audience, as it touched on the universal values of family responsibility and personal integrity. The contrast between her public image as a compassionate advocate and the private reality presented by Cruz created a sense of profound disillusionment among many who had previously supported her. It raised the question of whether her activism was truly about helping people or whether it was a sophisticated form of content creation designed to advance her own status. The fifth and perhaps most strategically significant phase of this ideological interrogation centered on the Green New Deal, a legislative framework that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had championed as her signature contribution to the American political discourse. Senator Cruz characterized this proposal not as a scientific necessity, but as a sweeping mandate for a total economic and social transformation that would disproportionately burden the very working-class families she claimed to represent. He began by outlining the profound requirements of the plan: a fundamental restructuring of the American energy grid, the forced obsolescence of traditional internal combustion engines, and a radical shift in agricultural practices and dietary habits. Cruz argued that while the rhetoric surrounding the plan focused on saving the planet, the actual implementation would necessitate an unprecedented level of individual sacrifice from the average citizen sacrifices that Ocasio-Cortez herself appeared unwilling to make in her private life. He produced detailed travel logs and campaign expense reports, indicating that the Congresswoman frequently opted for short-haul flights between Washington, D.C. and New York City, a journey that could easily be accomplished via high-speed rail with a significantly lower carbon footprint. He noted the irony of a leader demanding that the public transition to more arduous forms of transport, while she prioritized her own convenience and time over her stated environmental principles. The critique deepened as Cruz addressed the socio-economic divide inherent in the transition to green energy. He pointed again to her high-end electric vehicle, noting that such a luxury was far beyond the financial capacity of most residents in the Bronx, who were already struggling with inflation and the rising cost of basic necessities. To illustrate the real-world impact of her policies, he invited a local small business owner to share his perspective. A plumber whose livelihood depended on a reliable, heavy-duty van to transport tools and equipment across the city, spoke with a voice heavy with resignation. He explained that there were currently no viable, affordable electric alternatives that could meet the demands of his trade, and that the mandates proposed in the Green New Deal would effectively price him out of his profession. He asked how he was expected to support his family and serve his community when the revolutionary in charge was making choices that would bankrupt the working man, while she continued to enjoy the perks of a high-salary, elite lifestyle. This testimony highlighted the cognitive dissonance between the theoretical goals of the progressive elite and the practical, day-to-day survival of the laboring class. Cruz then turned to the impact of these policies on the elderly and those on fixed incomes, many of whom were already feeling the sting of rising utility costs. He described a future where heating and cooling one's home would become a luxury, and where the freedom of personal mobility would be restricted to those who could afford the latest technological advancements. An elderly couple in the audience stood and shared their fears of being isolated in their own neighborhood, unable to afford the transition to an electric lifestyle and fearful that their modest savings would be swallowed by the skyrocketing costs of energy. They expressed a profound sense of betrayal, noting that they had initially believed her promises of a just transition, only to realize that the justice she spoke of did not seem to include the protection of their modest way of life. Cruz used these stories to frame the Green New Deal as a form of climate elitism, where the rules are designed for the masses, but the exemptions are reserved for the architects of the policy. He argued that Ocasio-Cortez's life remained comfortably insulated from the very regulations she sought to impose on everyone else, creating a paradigm where sacrifice is a mandatory requirement for the poor, but a voluntary suggestion for the powerful. The interrogation then expanded beyond Ocasio-Cortez herself to encompass the broader progressive movement she represents, often referred to in political circles as the Squad. Cruz argued that the patterns of hypocrisy observed in the Bronx were not isolated incidents, but were emblematic of a wider trend within this new wave of activism. He cited the example of Representative Ilhan Omar, who has been a vocal proponent of the defund the police movement, while simultaneously allocating hundreds of thousands of dollars from her campaign funds for private security services. He suggested that there is a fundamental ethical failure when a representative demands that their constituents live in increasingly dangerous neighborhoods with reduced law enforcement while they themselves are protected by armed guards. He similarly addressed Representative Rashida Tlaib's calls for the abolition of the carceral system, noting that such radical policies are often advocated by those who live in gated or high-security environments, far removed from the actual consequences of rising crime rates. The critique was aimed at the perceived insulation of the progressive elite, who appeared to embrace radical ideologies only because they are shielded from the fallout by their own wealth and status. The narrative then turned to Representative Ayanna Pressley and Representative Cori Bush, both of whom have faced scrutiny for their lifestyle choices and security expenditures that seem to contradict their public stance on economic equality and police reform. Cruz argued that this group functions more as a collection of lifestyle influencers than as traditional legislators, using their platforms to cultivate a brand of rebellion while enjoying the traditional perks of the establishment. He noted that even the elder statesman of the movement, Senator Bernie Sanders, was not immune to such critiques, pointing to his multiple residences and his status as a millionaire, a status he achieved through the very capitalist mechanisms he frequently denounces. Cruz suggested that the socialism promoted by these figures is a performance designed for a digital audience, a way to channel the genuine frustrations of the working class into a movement that ultimately serves the interests of the leaders more than the followers. He characterized this as a form of champagne socialism, where the rhetoric of revolution is served alongside the reality of elite privilege. Finally, the inquiry addressed the role of Senator Elizabeth Warren, whom Cruz described as a foundational figure in the creation of the progressive brand. He revisited the controversies surrounding her claims of indigenous ancestry, framing them as a cynical attempt to utilize the language of marginalized identity for professional and political advancement. He noted that she, like many of her colleagues, had built a significant personal fortune while lecturing the American public on the evils of wealth accumulation. This broader analysis was intended to show the people of the Bronx that Ocasio-Cortez was not an aberration, but a part of a systematic shift in American politics toward performative activism. This is a style of governance where the optics of a viral moment, a cleverly worded tweet, or a dramatic protest are prioritized over the slow, difficult work of actual policymaking and constituent service. Cruz argued that this shift has left the working class without genuine representation, as their leaders are more concerned with their standing in the digital attention economy than with the economic health of their districts. In his concluding remarks, Senator Cruz turned his attention back to the audience and the camera, delivering a final summation that tied these various threads of hypocrisy into a single, cohesive message. He argued that the era of Instagram socialism has been exposed as a hollow enterprise, one that relies on the exploitation of real suffering to fuel a manufactured digital revolution. He urged the people of the Bronx and Americans across the country to demand a return to a politics of substance, where a representative's success is measured not by their follower count, but by the tangible improvements they bring to the lives of their constituents. He called for a movement of accountability, where the socialist, socialite, and the champagne socialist are held to the same standards they demand of everyone else. The evening ended not with a victory for any one political party, but with a profound challenge to the culture of modern politics. The trial in the Bronx had served its purpose. It had stripped away the digital filters and the rehearsed rhetoric to reveal the stark reality of the disconnect between the elite activist and the working-class citizen. As the residents filed out of the community center and back into the reality of their daily struggles, the question that remained was whether they would continue to accept the performance or whether they would demand a leader who truly shared their burdens and their dreams.